5 seconds to submergence. Submergence deep into the absurd.
All right, Jamal Lyksett is back in the living room studio of Into the Absurd. And I got a little quote for you from Nietzsche's The Will to Power. Here reigns the coarse, sensualistic prejudice that sensations teach us truths about things that I cannot say at the same time of one and the same thing, that it is hard and that it is soft. The instinctive proof. I cannot have two opposite sensations at the same time. Quite coarse and false. The conceptual ban on contradiction proceeds from the belief that we are able to form concepts, that the concept not only designates the essence of a thing, but comprehends it. In fact, logic, like geometry and arithmetic, applies only to fictitious entities that we have created. Logic is the attempt to comprehend the actual world by means of a scheme of being posited by ourselves, more correctly, to make it formulatable and calculable for us. There's some Nietzsche for you.
Yeah, there's some Nietzsche. Yeah, that's great.
It kind of ties back to critical thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I put people through, 8 weeks of logic and but the whole time through, right, I try to remind students that what we're doing there is we're sort of taking a slice. It's like a mathematical point that doesn't actually exist, right? So what we're doing is work that, in a sense, is an illusion. But history, philosophy tells us that that's what is the most real, right? I mean, going back to Plato, what Nietzsche is doing there is basically reversing the Platonic obsession with concepts as the most real. And so the way that we try to capture experience, so we can kind of make sense of it, hold on to it, is that we put it into a box, right? These conceptual boxes that Nietzsche's talking about, and then it becomes easy for us to deal with, and we don't have to deal directly with experience. But like in reality, right, experience is always going to undermine those concepts, right? We're gonna make those concepts sort of difficult to fit. And I think a lot of like the history of philosophy, history of any sort of discipline that deals with theory and has a conceptual framework, is the history of that misfitting garment, that has been created, right? That it's because it's never can fit, fully. It's trying to capture something that's changing all the time, that's always in flux. And always has way too much complexity to it for the human mind to be able to hold on to. I mean, there's just too much there. But we can experience it, right? We can experience it, and have like a real engagement with it. But we can only do that if we get rid of that garment, right? It's kind of like, Nietzsche talks about at his really close to, or soon after he had that run-in, or that sort of embracing of the horse when he sort of fell down, and the beginning of what people describe as this like long period of insanity. And he talked about during that time that he
oh, you mean when that horse died, right? He was on a street and he saw a horse died, and it kind of...
Well, the horse was being beaten by its owner, and and so he embraced the horse, and but he sort of saw himself naked at his funeral. And I think that like standing, like he had these like dreams, right? Twice that he was like naked at his own funeral. And I think that Nietzsche is sort of telling us, I mean, I think just in general, he's telling us that we need to basically live life as though we're naked, right? Like quit arming ourselves with all this stuff, right? Like be ourselves in the world, you know, and we're going to fail, you know, we're going to struggle, right? We're going to suffer. Failure is sort of a term that we use when we talk about some sort of expectation, right? Like some sort of a goal that is fixed.
But there's a million goals.
Well, there's a million goals, or there's no goal, right? Mm-hmm. Like perhaps Nietzsche's saying like there's no actual goal. We as humans perhaps can't help but have goals. Like we sort of see the world as purposeful, or we ourselves need a purpose, and so we create that. Now, I don't think Nietzsche has a problem if we create that and we know that we've created it. Where he has a problem is if we take that goal to be an absolute, and something that we have like discovered that like is given to us by the world, and there's nothing given to us by the world in that way as a goal. So. Yeah, no, I really like that quote. I think it's a good, and I should mention, you know, to find good quotes like that in the Will of Power is great. You know, Will of Power is a very complicated book, though. I mean, the publication of it's very complicated.
Yeah, yes, it is. It's I mean, it's not. I mean, Nietzsche never intended for it to be published, right?
Or at least at a stage that it was, right? Like perhaps there are ideas in it that he would have at one point, you know, developed more, but yeah, it was published by his sister and edited by his sister, and she you know had a lot of nationalistic and anti-Semitic ideas that found their way into some of these works that she was part of editing, but obviously like Nietzsche still shines through in it, and you can hear it there. I mean that's essential Nietzsche, what you read. Yeah.
I mean, it's definitely some of his less developed ideas. It reads more simply and straightforward than most of the things that he writes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, he's definitely like, yeah, he can be hard to read.
Yeah, and I know I was reading this one. He was kind of critiquing the "I think, therefore I am" argument, and I thought it was interesting because he says that it's basically not. I mean, no, it just doesn't work. You can't really. I mean, that also there's a lot of suppositions that you have to make, some presuppositions that you have to make about that statement. Like for one, I think, therefore I am. First, you have to say that you are an I. I mean, it's a tautology. I think. Just saying that you are an I at the beginning means that you are, right? So you can't really say, I think, therefore I am, because, or at least you can't make that as an argument, because you're already saying I am by saying I to begin with.
Right, yeah. So the idea that we suddenly get like this unified consciousness with the argument, right? Like, I mean, as you sort of put it, there's circularity within it. It's, you know, I think, therefore I am, and you know, perhaps a more honest argument would be, there's thinking, therefore there's thinking, right?
Yeah.
Like, you know, that's what it tells us, and I think there's another part of that though that I do of that argument that I like, but you can't. This is sort of interpreted through Kierkegaard, right? The other big 19th century sort of existentialist figure. Like if you read Descartes, you know, Meditations on First Philosophy, and you sort of look at what he's doing, you can see that he's moving through his entire life. Trying to find the truth, right? So he starts off, you know, in childhood looking for it. He relies on teachers for a bit, trying to find it. He relies on, he finds that like, oh well, they're not very helpful, right? So he sort of just goes out into the world and tries to find it amongst, everyday people, and he finds that, although that's better, it's still not getting to where he wants, and so he ends up sort of closing himself off, right? And that's where you get into his sort of Cartesian skepticism, what we call Cartesian skepticism, meaning that it's not like a general attitude of skepticism, but it's using skepticism for a narrow purpose, right? And so he's saying, I'm going to be a skeptic, or treat the world as a skeptic for like the next bit as I go through this, and so for him it's like this experience, this like sort of an experiment that he's doing, right? And he's experiencing each sort of level of this as he doubts something. And so one criticism that I have, or when I sort of think of I think therefore I am, like, what is he doing? He's actually experiencing that. Like, he's having an experience of his own existence. And so when you sort of get to that point where he's trying to establish knowledge that does not require experience, right? But I think that this whole process for him was actually an experience, that removing, each of those layers, and you get to that sort of final point, that sort of narrow point, that he's touching on something that is purely experiential as well. And when I read Descartes, I often wish he would have like just gone a bit further. That he kind of stopped at a point. But anyway, but yeah, I think that there are problems with the argument as a starting point for rationalism, for this idea that there's some knowledge that we have that's certain, but or objective anyway. But as Kierkegaard says, what we find in there perhaps is a subjective truth, right? Not an objective truth, but a subjective truth. And that also like sort of links back to the idea of experience, right? Because we experience the world subjectively, right? That's why we like concepts too, is because we can share those with others, right? And we assume that the other person has the same understanding of that concept as we do, right? So it allows us to communicate, which is really important. But as when we get to sort of raw experience, it becomes much more difficult to communicate. Sometimes we can communicate those things with those who are like really close to us, but I think it's pretty difficult to do that. And so I think there's a lot, right, that Descartes, he was spending this whole time like shut up inside, and who knows like what that whole experience was for Descartes. But he wanted to sort of pull something out from it.
Yeah, I think Nietzsche would say his mistake was stopping, right? He shouldn't have stopped there.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I mean, I think that if he would have gone just a bit further, he would have realized the grounding of that sort of state that he was in. Yeah.
But also, we need a thought like that, right? Because if you're presented with that thought, then you can kind of continue where he left off, right? You can say, okay, I think, therefore I am. Now I can move beyond that with my own thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. I think you're right. Like, I think that Descartes became a foil, right, for other philosophers. He became, some philosophers went much further than he did in terms of this sort of hyper rationalism, but others, right, sort of saw where he made certain mistakes, and was, they were able to sort of develop something new. I think there's two things that are sort of interesting. One is the way that Descartes moves from that original argument out back to the world is through this series of arguments for God's existence. I think we live in an era now where philosophically God is quite often irrelevant, right? And so it's really difficult to see how you move from where Descartes was back out into, the world if you don't have God. And God was really a tool for Descartes in the in his essay there, right? Like you don't have that there, then you're kind of stuck inside yourself. I think that there is something though that we need to be careful with Descartes. Like I can sit here, I often find myself defending Descartes because he's beat up on so much. But there's one sort of part of us thinking that I think we can we need to hold up as problematic, and that's a sort of dualism and what that means for like the non-thinking world.
What do you mean?
So Descartes, right, when he sort of establishes the I think, therefore I am, what he means then by the I think, right, the thinking mind, he sort of takes this to be a human sort of faculty, right, that we have this ability to think rationally, and that's totally disconnected from our bodies, and that's totally disconnected from the rest of the natural world, right? And so he had a very mechanistic view of nature. He believed that non-humans, right, did not like really suffer or experience pain like we do, and so it was okay to treat them poorly. And this was sort of grounded in his sort of division of the mind from the body, right? That there are these two separate entities, two different in kind. And it wasn't as though he wasn't challenged on this, and he did some thinking about it. But I see that's a problem that we can't just sort of forgive Descartes for too easily.
Mm-hmm. And he himself was, as you said, like the history of philosophy is kind of just putting things in boxes that can't really be put in boxes, right? Like the objects that we're trying to put in the box are growing in size and the boxes that we have right now are smaller than what it's going to be, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the boxes are always either too small or too big.
Mm-hmm.
And so they either, it's like a, too large of a tool for it or insufficient for it. And that's just how it is. I think, the history of philosophy, like, although that's kind of what it is, I think that it's become much more honest now. That's what it's doing. And so, I think it's much more, humble and willing to sort of, address those sort of old things that old ideas, I guess. I think so there's that sort of humility there. I think also there's a recognition amongst a lot of philosophers, in probably the late 20th century, middle of 20th century on, where what we're doing is sort of creating concepts, and so seeing that that's what we are doing. And I think that too, like another big contribution of the last 50, 75 years is the recognition that within concepts there's often a lot of like violence and power that can go on within those, right? So we use those concepts and they can be used to like exclude, right? And so going back to this idea of the sort of the mechanistic, right? So we can sort of use that as an example, the like human animal distinction, right? To say animal, this is an argument that like people like Derrida. So Derrida sort of has looked at this, others have looked at this, but you sort of use this word animal and it has a certain meaning. And we tend to use it as distinct from human, right? Even though sort of in a proper sense, right, we're included within it. But we'll often use it in this sort of distinct way, so that allows us to make use of, right?
That's also a contextual thing sometimes.
Oh, sure, yes.
So I'll notice that, people say, oh, the animals, blah, 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 right? But then when they speak purely scientifically, just talking about all animals do this, right? Then they're talking about humans too sometimes.
Right. And I think that what we need to do, or sort of, is, I guess, to be more honest in the way we speak, right? So if we're trying to talk about humans and we're trying to sort of set ourselves, sort of against animals, like, one, maybe that's a problem, but two, like, just saying, hey, like, talk about like the non-human animals or whatever. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
But it can be dangerous when we are apart from animals, but I mean, all animals are apart from each other too, right? I mean, all hamsters are different than all the other animals.
Right.
So.
Yeah. I mean, and just sort of seeing that we have a common origin, that we, are largely very much alike, we're physically, pretty similar. We have the same organs, we have, and a lot of sort of non-human animals have some pretty, significant levels of thinking, and I think that and there's a lot of reasons why that's important. But I guess sort of saying that, like, we're either like the linguistic, the social, the political, whatever, like, we can sort of find things that sort of distinguishes us, but there's probably more things that, we have in common with sort of the non-human world, right? And it becomes a lot easier to destroy it if we only look at the things that we don't have in common.
Well, there's plenty of things that even me and you don't have in common.
Right, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, if you thought about it, perhaps an infinite number of things we have that are uncommon, but maybe an infinite number of things that we have that are in common. But as I say things, I mean that we could come up with, if we had an infinite amount of time, an infinite number of things that we have in common and uncommon.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's it too. It's like the diversity, right? The sort of like kind of radical diversity in the world, and that's probably also what Nietzsche was talking about. That the things in the world are just distinct from one another. Like, there's a sort of a singularity, right? That each thing has, and you can sort of engage each of those things or those events, right? Like, on its own, and it's not going to be the same as the next event or the other, whatever sort of the other thing. And while it's important to sort of recognize similarities, because we have to do that, right, to sort of get through the world, right? We have to say, okay, those are all trees, those are all chairs, those are, whatever. What we've done, I think, is sort of disregarded the other side, and which is that radical sort of diversity, and
that's the argument from On Truth and Lie in Extra Moral Sense, with like all leaves are really different from each other, right? But we call them leaves still.
Right. Yes. Yeah. We still call them leaves. But each one, right, obviously has its own little leaf experience, that it's sort of gone through. Yeah.
And I do have to say, my friend, he was telling me about how atheists and theists really aren't that different, in the sense that most like hardcore atheists that, they believe in the Big Bang, they believe in evolution. I mean, I believe in evolution, but the Big Bang is a little bit iffier for me, right? Because this is 13 billion years ago. I can't possibly say, okay, yeah, for certain this happened, right? But it's also a sort of theistic Christian sort of idealistic creation myth in a sense, because it was this time when everything was essentially one perfect unified thing, right? Had infinite energy, infinite density, infinite gravity, blah blah blah, la 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 la, right? And that's, I mean, what's that? That's God, right? That's God. I mean, we're saying that everything had to start at one point, right? And that's sort of a creation myth, right?
Yeah.
And atheists, they also aspire for they aspire to know everything. They aspire for something all-knowing, right? An all-knowing civilization. They aspire for God.
Yeah, so I mean, I think I think that's great. Like, we have this sort of like, it's sort of looking at like the history of the Enlightenment, right? And I mean, this goes back to Descartes. Right? Descartes was trying to do that, right? Even though he comes from a theistic perspective, he was trying to establish stuff like science on some sort of grounding, and that was sort of the work of those early Enlightenment thinkers, that they were trying to know everything. And when this was a point when atheism, was first, I think, became a true live option for the intellectual world, right? Where it was still difficult to get published and get jobs if you're an atheist, but there were some pretty significant figures that were atheist, and I think that sort of went along, right, with this desire for complete human knowledge. There was the period that the encyclopedists, like Diderot, and others, were trying to sort of establish like a system of thought, in a like the encyclopedia, right? Sort of a set of books that was going to like give you everything.
Something permanent in a world of impermanences.
Yeah, a way to sort of grab onto things, and I often sort of think about those encyclopedists today and think, wonder what they'd think about Wikipedia, right? Because that's sort of a democratic, it's just sort of like massive bit of knowledge, right? That's been, I mean, like, who's done that, right? Where did that come from? And
it's awesome.
Yeah, no, it's really incredible. But yeah, so I think you're right, and then right. So there's this like attempt to get out of the myth, right? To sort of step outside of the myth, thinking that like, okay, if I can get outside of whatever mythology my society has given me, I can somehow get closer to the truth. Now that may be true, right? That possibly could be true. But what I think that denies is one of the ways that we know, and one of the ways that we establish deep knowledge, is through story and through mythologizing, right? And so if you exclude that as an important way of knowing, like, I think you exclude a significant amount of, and probably like, sort of those that you're thinking about in terms of being atheist, they would say, well, it's not really knowledge. Okay, so you're excluding a significant amount of meaning, right, in the world.
But they're attaching meaning to other things, right? They're attaching meaning to science, to the scientific method in particular, right? To mathematics in particular. Yeah,
good. So there's, yeah, I mean, there's a sort of like I guess what you're saying is like there's a new Ten Commandments, a new Bible, there are new priests, yeah, I mean, mathematics, sort of the new Platonism, and
it's something seemingly permanent.
Yep,
right.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think that's because, as I was saying, I think we can't help but treat the world, with a story, right? Like, we want coherence. We want things to sort of fit, into a whole.
Yeah, Nietzsche also said that we often define understanding as essentially conceptualizing something new with old terms and old ways, right? And that's kind of what a story does. Because with this same friend that I was telling you about, he and I were talking about consciousness, and we were comparing it to being in a vehicle, right? All cars are different, but they all perform the same function, right? They drive, right? But they have different things inside of them. They're going down different roads. They take perhaps different amounts of fuel, et cetera, right? But they all perform that same function of driving. And that's a good little story, right? And stories help us conceptualize things.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Oh, right. I mean, Nietzsche does. I mean, he says because language itself, right, is old knowledge, right? I mean, that's what language is. It's old bits of knowledge, and when we come upon new experience, right, we're going to use that old bits of knowledge. We're going to use. I mean, and you sort of mentioned the truth and lie in extra moral sense, right? And he talks about that like. It's all metaphor. And why is it all metaphor? Well, because when we apply those old things to sort of new realities, we're applying something that doesn't directly fit, but we're making that comparison. And so we're just constantly doing that. That's sort of a recycling that's forever going on. And not to say the language doesn't change, because it certainly does. But yeah, I mean, it's always a sort of bringing forward of stuff from the past. And it's kind of cool to sort of think that like we have recreated like this new reality, right? Whatever we're in now, right? I mean, it just
with old tools,
with like
right.
old tools, yeah. And like maybe it's kind of shabby, but like it's like there and it's somewhat functioning.
But I mean, it'd be impossible to create something new with something you haven't invented yet.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to invent a hammer out of things that you've already invented. Right. You can't just have a hammer just appear. Right. You have to have iron. You have to find a way to mold iron. You have to get a stick. You have to put it on, on the hammer. However, hammers are constructed. I don't know.
Yeah, no. But you're right. Like, and so that what that means then is that like that hammer is not like just that hammer, right? That hammer has within it all those old tools. Like it's internal. I mean, it's because but for those old tools, you wouldn't have the hammer. Right?
Yeah.
You take those old things away, like no hammer. And so that hammer then carries with it all of that old stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of, I mean, Nietzsche criticizes Christianity a lot, as we know. But without Christianity, Nietzsche would be nothing. Be a blip.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that one thing he respected, not necessarily like he wouldn't say it's just about Christianity, right? Because he looked a lot to the ancient Greeks and right, but is that idea of story, right? That we have what we now talk about in terms of like the archetypal. We have these things that we use, and he and one of his most famous books, Thus Spake Zarathustra, right? That's what he sort of took an old image, right?
Yeah.
So Zarathustra, an old messenger of God, and sort of transformed Zarathustra into something new. And
it's like if someone wrote a story about Jesus today, right?
Yeah. But I mean, he turns Zoroaster on his head. He turns Zarathustra on his head. That Zarathustra was one of the the early sort of moral conceptualists, that he sort of divided things between good and evil, and so Nietzsche, sort of famous, right, for trying to undo that dichotomy, then uses Zarathustra, the character of Zarathustra, to try to undo what he did before, what Zarathustra did before. So, yeah.
Sort of redeems Zarathustra.
There you go. Yes, it's the Nietzschean redemption of Zarathustra.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Yeah, I think a lot of these ideas, I can see why you're more inclined towards Nietzsche and Buddhism. They're very, very similar in the sense where he kind of disassociates himself with ideas of truth or ideas of being an I, a person, a thinker, right? I mean, obviously Nietzsche kind of goes beyond Buddhism almost, in a sense, in a way that he even criticizes saying that you can't be an I, criticizes the person who says that they can't be an I, because they themselves are a person who says that they can't be an I, right?
Right. Yeah. No, I think Nietzsche, and I think that's a good comparison. And there's a lot they do share. I mean, I think that Nietzsche criticized Buddhism on kind of a lot of fronts. I think one thing that he struggled with Buddhism was its sort of treatment of desire and passion. And I think that Nietzsche wanted to hold on to desire and passion, right? That's not something that we should give up. We shouldn't necessarily give up suffering. And so he recognizes sort of the same realities as Buddhism.
Yeah, but don't reject life, right? Don't affirm life. Don't disaffirm it.
And I think what he saw, Buddhism as doing was rejecting something essential about life, in order to achieve happiness or fulfillment and peace. And maybe it's a different focus, right? Maybe it's just sort of, Nietzsche sort of saw one thing as the goal, right? Maybe he had these goals that maybe he himself didn't recognize as being goals, and he had those, and that's what led Nietzsche along a certain path, and maybe the Buddha had different goals, and that's what led the Buddha along a different path.
Yeah, they had different ideals, right? They were kind of trapped in their own ideals. Maybe not trapped, but they created their own ideals in which they explored.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think what something you said is that Nietzsche couldn't be Nietzsche without Christianity. And I think that Christianity takes things like emotion seriously. Like, it doesn't reject emotion, doesn't reject suffering. And so I think that perhaps that's a part of what Nietzsche took with him, right? Didn't give up. Of course, he would say, "Oh, I'm going back to Dionysus," right? Like, that's where I'm getting that from. But it's there in Christianity too.
There's also a lot of, the will to power, right? That's truth is just the idea that's the most powerful.
Yeah, I think that's, and I think that's something to, I think people hear terms like, or phrases like, the will to power, or like the Übermensch, the overhuman, or the, sometimes translated as the superhuman or Superman. And I think that it often creates a lot of misconceptions of Nietzsche. And I think that and
his sister was a part of that too.
And his sister was a part of that.
A huge part.
Yeah, his sister and his old friend, Wagner was a part of that, and especially his brother-in-law, so I guess Forster. They were all sort of a part of that, and the legacy, right, that sort of followed from them. They were able to sort of take those concepts that Nietzsche had created, and distort them, use them for their own ends. And what's I think particularly problematic is that that all of these, I mean, sort of this trying to create a society of sameness, excluding all difference, right? I mean, that's the extreme end of sort of the fascism that they were after, that no one can be different, right? And what Nietzsche was saying is, no, we're all different, and embrace that difference, right? Like, quit bowing down to what was given to you previously. Like, it's exactly the opposite. And that's what we're talking about, the will to power. That's what we're talking about, the overman, right? Like, because all the others, right, have sort of just given it up, right? They've sort of given up their own lives to the general, right, life, the society as it is, and that's enough for them, or they think it's enough for them.
And that's mediocre, right? He was against mediocrity. Don't be like everyone else,
right?
You know? Be powerful, be yourself, be naked.
And I think that's exactly right. And I think, you just sort of look at, like, the way Nazis treated stuff like art, and so this idea of a place of creativity, right, sort of pushed aside.
Burn it.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, so, it's interesting. I mean, it's the like tragic irony of it is, like, Nietzsche is a figure that predated his time in criticizing what became those big nationalist movements of the mid 20th century, and then his own family being a part of all of that, right? His sister still being alive as that was getting going. So it's so that's it's ironic, but it's pretty tragic, and I have a lot of sympathy for Nietzsche, and I think that he was somebody that was never really happy or joyful, but I think he did find some meaning in life through his work.
Well, I mean, he found, all of his meaning from his work. Right? His work and being out in nature, his hikes. His, he conceived Zarathustra in this lake in Switzerland, I believe. Mm-hmm. So.
And Sils Maria, where he sort of he left Germany and moved to Switzerland. So claiming because of his health, and that's where he spent his life. And I think it was, I think environment's important. Where you are is important. If you're sort of an urban, person, if you're someone out like Nietzsche was, each of those can create very different views of the world. And I think maybe the ability to have solitude, and maybe that's something that Nietzsche also was ahead of his time on, is that, like, knowing that we as human beings were going to be sick because we both lack solitude, right? We don't have real solitude anymore, real silence.
We really don't anymore.
But also, we're so incredibly lonely.
Yeah.
We have no real friendships anymore, or very few. I'm saying we none of us do, but but you sort of look at a lot of the psychological work that's being done lately, and then they sort of study people and and ask people whether or not they have close friends or have people that they can confide in, and so few people do, and Nietzsche's sort of experience with friendship also was, I think, really difficult for him. So he didn't have a lot positive to say there, I don't think. But he certainly had some stuff to say about solitude, and
I'm sure it was difficult for him to relate to people. He was a bit ahead of his time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's what happens, and that's what should. In a sense, that's the condition of the great thinker, of the great,
Yeah, it's a tragedy of the artist, really, like the great artist, you know.
Yeah, great artist, great philosopher. Any of those, they should be radicals. Just by nature, they should be radicals. If you're not a radical and you're a philosopher or you're an artist, right? It's like, well, what are you doing? You're copying, right?
Yeah.
And so yeah. So if you're a mind like Nietzsche's, or Kierkegaard, or Camus, right? Like, there's going to be some struggle there. Although Camus seemed to do okay with like being a good social human being.
Yeah.
So
you always see those. I mean, this picture, he just looks cool.
yeah, he's got the
A little cigarette in his mouth. He's
yeah.
I mean, won the Nobel Prize for literature.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So I guess he was accepted by
Not accepted by cars though. He got killed in a car crash. So.
That's true. Yeah.
Poor guy.
Yeah.
But him and Nietzsche and all these existentialists, they embraced suffering, right? And suffering was something that, I mean, even loneliness, right, that Nietzsche experienced, or at least we assume that he experienced loneliness, right? Maybe not, I mean, loneliness from other people, perhaps not loneliness from the world and loneliness from his philosophy, but this suffering, I think, kind of drives the great works of these amazing artists. Even Van Gogh. Have you seen At Eternity's Gate on Netflix?
No.
Do you have Netflix?
I do.
You gotta watch it.
All right.
It's so good. It's about Van Gogh's life, but it also reflects not really on Van Gogh's life, but more so if you kind of look at it from this lens, right? It kind of shows the life of a genius, right? Someone who's kind of, you suck, your ideas are terrible. No one's ever going to love your art or your philosophy or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And then you see, now today you see Van Gogh's one of the most famous painters in human history, right? Beautiful paintings.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I mean, he would carry those paintings around with him all over, and and just couldn't make it. As I mean, it's interesting that like somebody else is making a lot of money, or other people make a lot of money off of his artwork, right? Like he didn't get to experience that, and I think that's, but also like I don't think. I mean, it would have been nice, right, if he would have gotten a little bit of that, but that's not usually what they're after, right? Like a great artist, a great philosopher, a great author, a great whatever. Like, yes, of course, they want to be compensated, right? They want, to have a comfortable life like the rest of us, but they're usually not after that. Like, if they were after that, they would be painting something very different.
They're after the intrinsic, not the extrinsic.
Yeah.
And that's what makes their work so amazing.
Yeah. I mean, because if you're talented like Van Gogh, then you can paint stuff that other people will buy, right? But you choose to paint, what you find to be, beautiful or the truth or whatever, right? Like, and so that's part of the suffering, right? Like you are not going to be embraced. A few, once in a while you've run into figures that were, that did have a bit of success in their lifetime. Like David Hume had a bit, although he never could get a job teaching he could not get hired as a professor. Poor Nietzsche could get hired as a professor really young, but couldn't keep working because he was ill. But yeah, so it's not all that common. At least it doesn't seem to be. Maybe in the 20th century, like the existentialists, they were, I think, pretty well, accepted and read by a lot of people.
But that's also, I mean, you have to wonder. there's also just an increase in population, right? And it's easier for ideas to spread now than they were in the past. And it's also easier to be forgotten about today than it ever has ever before.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, yeah, easier to be discarded for sure. You know, and I guess if you got a lot of mistakes, you know, you can sort of fall back into that too. So it's got its ups and its downs. But yeah, you're right. Yeah, I don't know. We talk about like great minds. I don't know what like greatness is, you know, now. I'm not sure.
Well, you have to define it yourself.
I guess so. Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll leave it off there. Be great. Define your own greatness. Be powerful. Do what you love. That's Into the Absurd with Jamal Lyksett.